Alrighty. Welcome everybody to part 2 of our 5-part Talking About Israel series. Today's session, entitled Narratives of Israeli Nationalism, will be somewhat of a more of a deep dive than our first session. It's going to be a focus on some of the more prominent topics of Israeli nationalism, such as Zionist discourse in the 19th century, Jewish political legacy, and Zionism in Israeli society. Today's speaker, who we are very lucky to have, is Joel Burnie. Joel is the Associate Director of Public Affairs at the Australian Israel and Jewish Affairs Council, and he has over 10 years of Jewish community service under his belt. He's also got a BA in Political Science and a Master's of Law from Monash University. Of course, none of this would be possible without the continued generosity of our supporters, so we'd like to thank them for that. And similar to last week, we will have time for questions at the end of the session, so if you do have any burning questions that you'd like to ask Joel while we have him here, please comment them in the comment section. With that said, I'm going to hand it off to Joel to kick us off for part 2 of Talking About Israel. Joel, take it away.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Joel Burnie and I'm the Associate Director of Public Affairs at the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council. Now, just a little bit of an introduction before we get into the substantive elements of this webinar. This lecture that I did last year was over I think a 90 minutes or 2-hour period. So I've tried to truncate it down to about 25 to 30 minutes and tried to make a very thick, historically dense subject to be as stimulating and entertaining as possible. I am very aware that your time this evening is precious and there are many other entertainment avenues and webinars that you've been inundated with in recent times. So I thank you for being with me today. And I hope that even though it's a virtual audience, I can't see you or interact with you as I normally would, my hope is that my little spiel will be entertaining enough to keep you hooked, and then there'll be some good questions to come out of it at the end. Just a little bit about myself and the organization that I work for. As Joey mentioned in the introduction, I've had extensive experience in the Jewish community through the national president of AIJAC, and then an early career doing student advocacy for AIJAC, and now working more prominently in more senior roles there. AIJAC does a phenomenal job advocating for Israel and Jewish community issues. It's highly politically active. It has a policy department that pumps out an excessive and a huge amount of awesome material, original material that you can find on our website at aijac.org.au, as well as our Facebook and Twitter pages at AIJAC Update. Have a look for them. The original content that we pump out of both our Melbourne, Sydney offices are fantastic. One of the more public areas of our work is our Rambam programs, our study visits to Israel, which I'm lucky enough to assist with the operations of and getting to lead some of them. In these groups, we send a lot of non-Jewish people, opinion makers, and movers and shakers to Israel, including politicians, journalists, students, clergy, academics, diplomats, you name it. If they're opinion makers, we try and send them, and that is I'm very, very lucky to be a part of such an amazing program. So tonight we're here talking about Israel, a series, I guess, to educate and to discuss certain topics that come about when it comes to Israel. So I'm discussing narratives of Jewish nationalism. So bear with me. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and switch to my PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully Zoom will make it easy, but just please bear with me while I do. There just may be a little lag for a second or two, and I apologize for that. Okay, fantastic. Now, hopefully this all works. If we have any technical difficulties, please stand by with me and hopefully we can rectify them quickly. So we're going to start off with a picture of these coins. Now you'll say to yourself, modern Zionism, 1897, First Zionist Congress. Why am I looking at something that looks rather ancient? Now, this is an antique coin that was minted in after 70 AD with the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, one of the last battles of the Great Jewish Revolt against the Romans. And as you'll see, the two coins here, it was minted by the Roman Emperor Vespasian to celebrate the capture of Judah and the destruction of the Second Temple by his son Titus. Now, in Latin, you will see that apart from the emperor's head on one side, you'll see in this palm tree, which was a symbol of Israel, and it says Judah Capta in Latin. This was a coin celebrating the sacking of the Second Temple, the exile of the Jewish people out of Judah in the year 70 AD. And it's a coin that was found, some of these coins have been found in and around Jerusalem, and also they were minted in the Roman Empire. They are a well-known archaeological and minted coin from the period, which shows clearly the celebration of the Romans in capturing Judah. Now, this will frame essentially what we're trying to achieve tonight. We're going to look at the evolutions of modern Jewish nationalism through the definition and the variants of Zionism, which is the Jewish national movement. And we will start off with its exile in 70 AD, because this is critically important, not just to the discourse of what our modern Zionist leaders were talking about in the late 19th century, but also frames the emotional attachment to Jewish self-determination in the land of Israel, stretching back to even over 2,000 years ago. So it's an important place to start. Now, the way that I try to dive into the issues of Jewish nationalism is to look at some terms and some definitions, and then look at some main characters within the historical account and have a look at what they've said, what's on the record, what are their quotes, to understand the narratives from that perspective. So that's the journey that I hope to go on tonight. So firstly, I'll try to be as not so academic, because I think the boredom levels will increase very quickly, but I'll try and flip through these as quickly as possible. So Zionism, what is Zionism? The term Zionism was coined in 1890. The general definition means a national movement for the return of the Jewish people to their homeland and a resumption of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. And it has different variants and different streams within that not all happened at the same time. Some fractured off from others, but essentially there's certain discrete groups that Zionism can be placed into. So we have political Zionism, that's the Zionism of Theodor Herzl, the idea that diplomacy and working through the institutions that governed the world at the time was the best way to advocate for the re-establishment of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. Theodor Herzl, will get into a little bit of his story, but essentially he was impacted greatly by a rise in anti-Semitism in Europe, and saw that the only way to protect Jews from anti-Semitism was to create their own sovereign nation state where they could essentially protect themselves, and they could grow and be prosperous on their own. During the time, it's important to know that at the time in the 1890s, there were about 60 sovereign states at the time. They were majority kingdoms or remnants of colonial empires. So the same landmass that we have today, where 206 sovereign nation states exist, it was far less in those days. However, after the French Revolution and the essential weakening of the colonial system, counteracted by the surge of nationalism and the nation states and the balance of power political theory, the idea that certain self-determination movements were coming out of these empires, desiring their own independence, their own sovereignty within a discrete geographical border, wasn't unique to the Jewish idea of self-determination. So within this time, and then obviously culminating in the end of World War I, where the globe is starting to be redivided, Zionism as a self-determination movement of the Jewish people was already well established. Then there are branches off that we will go into throughout tonight's presentation. We have labor Zionism from Ben Gurion, as a leader, was obviously part of the World Zionist Organization, became the first Prime Minister of Israel in 1948. He was a economically socialist. He believed that a socialist economy in Israel, where big government could steer the newly established country, was the right way of going. So that's the foundation of labor Zionism. We have practical Zionism, which is essentially suggesting that settlement of the land, purchasing of the land, working of the land, building civil institutions was the right way of going in the pre-state diplomatic arena. That if the Jewish people or the Jewish population inside Mandate Palestine could show of the institutions that they were building, that they had pre-state, they were able to handle the functionings of a sovereign state before they were given independence. So not these streams aren't necessarily at odds with each other. Some come out of others at different times, and also throughout history, these streams modify themselves from pre-state establishment of the state to post-establishment of the state, because these streams then become politicized into forming the main political parties in Israel. And then that sort of changes their interactions and their ideologies because of the political dynamic. And we'll get to that when we analyze the composition of the current Israeli Knesset. Then you have revisionist Zionism by Zev Jabotinsky. Now, revisionist Zionism broke off from the World Zionist movement in the early days. Also had its own streams. Essentially, their main difference was they wanted to work with the British to come to a negotiated agreement for the establishment of Israel, and not as a negotiated agreement between multiple parties, ultimately resulting in the partition of Israel, which had been set throughout the 30s, the 1937 Peel Commission, then again in 1947, and adopted by the United Nations in 47, and then allowed for the establishment of the state in 1948. So Jabotinsky and the revisionists were against the partition. We'll go into a few quotes of Jabotinsky. That also led to a little bit of a difference when it came to the overall Zionist movement in their actions in Mandate Palestine, specifically in the 30s and the 40s. Right, you'll have the Irgun, which was a break off of the Haganah, which used different tactics than what the Haganah did, which was the main Jewish resistance movement, organized Jewish resistance movement in pre-state Israel. So these branches ultimately had some interesting effects in the historical narrative of Israel, and then they essentially their differences are crystallized within the political system of the post-state establishment. Cultural Zionism, Achad Ha'am, the idea that the creation of a sovereign state of Israel was going to be able to guarantee and enshrine the Jewish culture within language, within food, within performing arts, and that the way to promote the state and to promote that self-determination was essentially bringing everyone in and centralized in Jewish culture and allowing Jewish culture, not necessarily religious culture, but Jewish culture and Jewish heritage to steer the pathway forward for Zionism. Interestingly, religious Zionism branches off from cultural Zionism and brings in those religious elements to suggest that the establishment and functioning of the state is a divine miracle that can precipitate great things for the Jewish people, and that even though that the Mashiach hasn't come, that a stable, functioning and working Jewish state is a great setup for that future coming of the Mashiach. And then you have progressive Zionism, which is a stream of Zionism for the progressive community, which focus strongly on Tikkun Olam and a lot of other social justice projects and ideologies inside Israel. Very, very Zionist, has had an interesting history when it comes to integrating with the institutions in Israel itself. Some would argue that things have got better in recent years. Others would argue that there's a long way to go, but we can talk about that in questions. Interestingly now, so these streams exist in the first Zionist Congress in 1897, and then go on as either working together or working against each other in the pre-state deliberations before the state is established. But interestingly now, we're in the midst of an election for the World Zionist Organization Congress, which is coming up this year, and these same streams of Zionism are represented even by Australian groups now. So AIJAC represents the progressive Zionism, Meir represents Labour Zionism, the Mizrahi represents the religious Zionism, Friends of Likud is a stream of revisionist Zionism. So even in from the first Congress in 1897 to Congresses now under the same body, these streams still exist. So they're equally as important as they were back then as what they are now. And it's very interesting that within this very old institution, these old ideological lines still exist. The point is that when it comes to narratives of Israeli nationalism, even in the pre-state era, it's a kaleidoscope of different ideas of ideology. For instance, the Labour Zionism were economic socialists, whereas the revisionist Zionisms were economic liberalists. So they had a different idea of even how the country should operate when sovereignty would exist. The revisionists didn't believe that the partition of Mandate Palestine, creating Transjordan in the early 20s was something that they wanted to go for, whereas some on the other side believed that if that was the case and that allowed greater steps on the western banks of the Jordan River for a creation of a independent Jewish state, then they would accept the creation of. So all these little differences come into play before, and then obviously they're enshrined afterwards in the political differences inside the Israeli political electorate, and we'll get to that towards the end of the lecture. Hope you're all still with me. Now, it's also really important to note that some people will claim that certain historical events were critical in the lead up to the establishment of the state. You'll hear many people, and I've been accused many times to say that Israel only exists because of the Holocaust, right? Or that it was a colonial enterprise to colonize, to essentially bring white Jews from Europe and colonize indigenous Arab populations in Palestine. It's important to note that even the modern ideas of anti-Semitism essentially popularized by the first Zionist Congress in 1897, the idea of a rebirth of Jewish sovereignty inside Israel didn't escape the Jewish people since that coin was minted in 70 AD, the first coin that I showed you in Juris Doctorate, right? Our religious practices, our longing for the return to Zion, the return to Jerusalem, and the return to Israel existed and remained with us for those 2,000 years. And now here's a speech that you'll see from 1845 of a rabbi born in Sarajevo but lived in Jerusalem. He, in this piece called The Third Redemption, he reflects on the Zionist view combining labor, religious and cultural ideas. So the labor form of Zionism, the religious form of Zionism, and also cultural Zionism into one, and merging it as a plan for the redemption of the Jewish people. And here are the quotes from 1845. "We as a people are properly called Israel only in the land of Israel. Undoubtedly, our greatest wish is to gather our exiles from the four corners of the earth to become one bond. We are, alas, so scattered and divided today because each Jewish community speaks a different language and has different customs. These divisions are an obstacle to redemption. Once the name of Israel is again applied to our land, all Jews will be inspired to help this company with all the means at their disposal. Though this venture will begin modestly, its future will be very great." Now, I read this, and it's emotional to think that the words of a rabbi from so long ago, 50 years before the first Zionist Congress was even established, had this idea of gathering Jews all together for our own cultural, religious survival, for our own benefit, for the explosion of our own culture. It was necessary to go back to our biblical land of Israel, not necessarily for Jewish sovereignty in northwestern Australia in the Kimberley regions or Uganda, for instance. But no, it needed to. There is a connection with Israel that's not easily or completely explained by religious ethos. Okay, the longing to go back to Israel was not just a religious or biblical longing; it was something that was culturally and enshrined and culturally enshrined within our people. And so it's just a nice little context to say, even 50 years before Herzl, witnessed the Dreyfus trial and became obsessed with the idea that anti-Semitism was our real issue. Even 50 years before that, we have coherent discussion about a return to the land of Israel. Now, so Herzl, as the father of modern Zionism and of political Zionism, he was born in Hungary, in Budapest, and he witnessed a rise in anti-Semitism in Europe. He famously, as a journalist, which was his profession, covered the Dreyfus trial, where he saw the clear and blatant anti-Semitism, which led to the conviction, the wrongful conviction on treason charges. Now, in his book, The Jewish State, he quotes, "We are people, one people, oppression, persecution cannot exterminate us. No nation on earth has survived such struggles and sufferings as we have gone through." And so from that, he chairs the first Zionist Congress in 1897. And these are a few quotes, and I apologize having to read them verbatim. If you were in front of me, it would be a little bit more entertaining, but I'll go through it nonetheless. "Zionism demands a publicly recognized and legally secure homeland in Palestine for the Jewish people. This platform is unchangeable. If anyone thinks that Jews can steal into the land of their fathers, he's deceiving either himself or others. Nowhere is the coming of Jews so promptly noted as in the historical home of the Jews for the very reason that it is the historical home. The idea that you can't colonize your own land." And this is a really critical quote. So this quote was from a diary entry a few days after the World Zionist Congress in 1897. So were I to sum up the Basel Congress in a word, which I shall guard against pronouncing publicly, it would be this: at Basel, I founded the Jewish state. All right. If I said this out loudly today, I would be answered with universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, certainly in 50, everyone will know it, and everyone did know it, and everyone still does know it. If you will it, it is no legend. Im Tirtzu en zo agada. That's Theodor Herzl. In a diary entry a couple of days after the first Zionist Congress, he knows that laid the foundation for ultimately his vision of a sovereign Jewish state in the biblical land of Israel. We go on to a famous Labour Zionist, David Ben Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel. Born in Poland, survivor of the Holocaust, led political Zionist to the eventual declaration of Israeli independence in 1948 and became Israel's first Prime Minister. And here are some quotes. "In order to be a realist, you must believe in miracles." And I'll jump a few. "The acceptance of partition does not commit us to renounce Transjordan. One does not demand from anybody to give up his vision. We shall accept a state in the boundaries fixed today, but the boundaries of Zionist aspirations are the concern of the Jewish people, and no external factor will be able to limit them." 1937. So that date in 1937 is from the Peel Commission, right? Right at the writing was on the wall for European Jewry by then. The rise of Nazism had happened 4 years earlier in Germany, and things were already deteriorating greatly in Europe. And it was abundantly clear to use after the Nuremberg laws were passed that Hitler was no friend of the Jewish people and was coming after them. In 1937, after extensive diplomatic efforts to move forward on the creation of a Jewish state, the League of Nations and the Peel Commission offered a very, very small portion of the remaining mandate land, which became known as the Peel Commission Partition Plan. It was far less than what was even offered in 1947 by the United Nations. And even though it was such a small little slither of land, led by Ben Gurion, the Zionist movement accepted it and the Arabs rejected it. We can only ask what would have been if we were allowed to establish sovereignty in 1937 and allow refugees from Europe to enter into a sovereign Jewish state. Then it was one of those things that we'll never know of, but the quote shows Ben Gurion's, at that time, the emergent need for sovereignty due to the exact reasons as to what Herzl had prophesied 40 years earlier, that anti-Semitism was coming for us, and our survival, we needed our own sovereign state for our own survival. That's why we were willing to make such huge concessions in accepting such a small offer due to the emergent need that was required in Europe. Now, a few other main characters of Labour Zionism, and the reason why I put them on here is because in the post-state era, they become the political leaders of the early state. And we'll get to a graph which shows the shift in the politics from left to right, the historical shift. But nonetheless, when we look at Labour Zionism, we'll have a look at a few characters, and when we look at revisionist Zionism, we'll have a look at a few characters as well. Now, these quotes selective, these characters had a very long career in Israeli public service. They change their opinions over time, and it's not entirely fair to give you a quote here and a quote there to give you an idea to the person, to who the person is. So this is the disclaimer. Here's some quotes of these people that are attached to these people, and they would endorse them wholeheartedly. However, they were said at a certain period of time that had a lot of context around it. So I'm not including these to tarnish anyone's reputation at all, or to give my own personal biases. I don't believe I have any in this respect, but that's just a disclaimer. These are selective quotes from and famous quotes from these characters. They should be looked at through a wider context, not just a pure judgment of the individual. So we have Golda Meir. We can forgive them for killing our children. We cannot forgive them for forcing us to kill their children. We will only have peace with them when they love their children more than they hate us. A very, very well-known quote of Golda Meir, someone from the Labour Zionist movement that was obviously open to negotiations and potential partition with an Arab partner, but very, very nuanced in her approach to understand the realities that Israel faced under her tenure as Prime Minister, including the Yom Kippur War. Then we have Yitzhak Rabin. I was a military man for 27 years. I fought as long as there were no prospects for peace. Today, I believe that there are prospects for peace, great prospects. We must take advantage of this for the sake of those standing here and for the sake of those who do not stand here. And there are many among our peoples. This is, I believe this is from 1993 from Oslo. So this is Rabin's vision. And then we have Shimon Peres. In Israel, land lacking in natural resources, we learn to appreciate our greatest national advantage, our minds. Through creativity, innovation, we transformed barren deserts into flourishing fields and pioneered new frontiers of science and technology. So really encapsulating the modern Israel that Peres essentially left, an innovative society, coming up with novel and ingenious ways of improving life for everyone around the world. So taking that Tikkun Olam message, being able to export something without without having natural resources, which they actually have now, but to be able to export their smarts, their brains, and their innovation. Truly amazing. I'm cognizant of time, so we'll flip through this as quickly as I can. We have Jabotinsky, the main revisionist personality, broke off from the Zionist Congress, author of the Iron Wall, had a different approach to Israel's foes in both in the pre-state, encapsulated by, we cannot give any compensation for Palestine, neither to the Palestinians nor to other Arabs. Therefore, a voluntary agreement is inconceivable. All colonization, even the most restricted, must continue in defiance of the will of the native population. Therefore, it can continue and develop only under the shield of force, which comprises an iron wall, which the local population can never break through. This is our Arab policy. To formulate it any other way would be hypocrisy. And I devote my life to the rebirth of the Jewish state with a Jewish majority on both sides of the Jordan. So you can see here that this narrative is a little bit different from the political Zionists and also the Labour Zionists, which essentially led the diplomatic moves from the de facto pre-state into independence. But the revisionist camp has a very important historical role to play, but also a very important contemporary role. So as I said to you before, the revisionist movement spawns into the Likud political party, headed by Menachem Begin, then later by Yitzhak Shamir and Ariel Sharon, and now with Benjamin Netanyahu. So we have Menachem Begin, who won an election from Labour in 1977. Labour had led from the establishment of the state from 1948 until 1977, when when Menachem Begin and the Likud party take power. Begin says the partition of Palestine is illegal. It will never be recognized. Jerusalem was and will be forever our capital. Eretz Israel will be restored to the people of Israel, all of it and forever. Yitzchak Shamir, the settlement of land of Israel is the essence of Zionism. Without settlement, we will not fulfill Zionism. It's that simple. And Ariel Sharon, the Arabs have the oil, we have the matches. Now, you'll understand that my disclaimer at the start, specifically about the Sharon quote, this was obviously a quote from Sharon in I believe in the 70s or the late 60s, but Sharon as Prime Minister in the 2000s was a different character. So just so you understand, when we're talking about historical narratives, these characters had a very, very long association and were very, very active for a long time inside the Zionist movement. Now, importantly, all of these narratives merge when Israel becomes independent into some type of into the fabric of society. And as Israel, and as a lawyer and someone who is a legal stickler, Israel doesn't have a constitution, but its Declaration of Independence works as what they call a basic law. So it is a legal authority when it comes to big constitutional issues inside Israel. Now, through all of these narratives, even if they differ, they believe they should do this, they should do that. It all comes together when it comes to the tenets of the establishment of the state, which even if they disagree with or one part of the state doesn't necessarily conform to their ideology, they needed to fall under the legal, the established legal requirement based in the Declaration of Independence. So any bombastic comments about Arabs or anything like that, we need to look at the Declaration of Independence when we look to the legal crystallization of these narratives of Jewish nationalism. So the land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here they first attained statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave the world the eternal book of books. So here we've got cultural Zionism, we have religious Zionism in here, we have practical Zionism in here. It's all that we are linking back to that coin, this Judah chapter from 2,000 years ago. This was the birthplace of the Jewish people. After being forcibly exiled from our land, Judah chapter, the people kept faith with it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom. This right is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate. Like all other nations in their own sovereign state, the state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places for all the religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. This, ladies and gentlemen, is Israel's constitution. Okay, this is the convergence of all the narratives into one document for all the people, not just inside Israel, but outside, to see exactly the foundation as to what Israel was created on. For equality of all people, even though it's a Jewish country, it is the birthplace of the Jewish people, and it will allow the gathering of the exiles. It will not discriminate against any inhabitants based on religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom for everyone, including conscience, language, education, culture. And I think to the majority of the extent with the type of demographics it has and also its geographical location, it does a pretty decent job. Now, this is the graph that I wanted to show you. It's going to be hard to see on your computer screens, but don't worry, we're just going to talk about the colors. This shows you the political system and who was in power over the left-right spectrum from the establishment to 2019. So it does not include the results from the last 3 elections. But what I want you to focus on is in the dark blue with the Mapai, which was the precursor to the Labour Party. If you look from 1945 until 1977, the left of the political left of Israel has the majority, okay? And then that starts to shift after 1977, where that dark blue gets smaller and smaller and smaller. The lighter blue gets bigger, 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 and the red during the 2000s gets bigger. Now the red are centrist parties like Kadima, like Kahol Lavan, for instance. Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid's party is a centre party. Then the light blue are the religious parties, which are sort of getting bigger as well. And then the lighter blue, which is getting bigger from 77 onwards, is Likud. So you can see here that during 48 to 77, the political left was in control, and then that has shifted to periods of far more right-wing dominance, and then maybe a mix of right and centre, and then ultimately now to a right majority. That even 3 successive elections with a very strong centrist candidate was unable to tip the scale into the centre left's favour. So if we look at the final election results from the March election in 2020, the final results that we have now of the current Knesset, and it's a little bit different, I'll go into that. You'll see that you have 58 on the right, 55 on the center, and then 7 in Israel Beiteinu. Apart from the fact that Israel Beiteinu didn't want to join the coalition, you can add those 7 to the right wing, which would give you 65 to 55. Okay, so the right numerically has been stronger since the mid to late 70s and remains stronger today. And the only prospect for that right dominance to be challenged is from a centrist candidate as opposed to a leftist candidate. To the point now that you'll see there that on 7 points on the red side, you have Labour, Gesher, and Meretz, which was a merger. That no longer exists. And Labour is essentially has broken off, and 2 of the top 2 Labour MKs have moved over into the newly formed Netanyahu government. Essentially now, the Labour Party, which dominated Israeli politics for the first 30 to 40 years of its existence, came back into power with Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, and then with Ehud Barak, is essentially disappearing before our eyes. They might be replaced by other parties inside that left-wing bloc, but their numbers are struggling to meet the threshold. So it does show you that that there is some fluctuations in the Israeli political system, where there is a shift from a historical left to more the center and to more the center right. So that's just a statistical analysis. It's not necessarily my ideological preference. It's just to suggest that since then, as you can see from the previous slide, that you'll see a movement. So from those pre-state narratives that get crystallized into political parties, then the people of Israel then get to vote and make their decisions as to which one of those narratives they want to support at any given time. During the peak of the peace movements in the late 80s, well, in the early 90s, when Rabin takes over, that's when the labor movement did incredibly well. But with the failure of Oslo, it really did signal a very, very tough time, if not the death of the left's dominance on the Israeli politics. And they haven't been able to recover since Netanyahu beat Barak many, many, many years ago. So I want to finish up here on this coin. So you will see that you'll have the original coin that I showed you, the Juris Doctorate. Now, this is how I want to end on it. So 2,000 years ago, the Romans mint a coin, Juris Doctorate. In 1958, the Israeli mint, to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of independence, minted a gold medal. And it's that one there of a young woman holding up a baby and a worker planting a tree under the palm tree. And it says, Israel Liberata, okay? This is the embodiment of all Jewish narratives together, that the connection to Israel and to its establishment is not a modern manifestation. It's from 2,000 years of longing since the exile, that the symbol, that Roman symbol of Juris Doctorate, is now Israel Liberata, right? The freedom of Israel. And I think that even if the narratives diverge from one another, that they can all agree that within their Zionist project, that this is the symbol, that we are now in our sovereign state, we are now free, and now it's up to us to try and work within everyone's narrative to form the best sovereign country and the best nation state of the Jewish people that we can have. So I'm going to hand it off there. Thank you very much for listening. Joey, I'll hand it off to you for some question and answers.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for that. I've got quite a number of questions here. Some of them are a bit meaty, so we might jump right in. So one of the first ones, I guess, is what do you see as the role of Jewish nationalism and Zionism today in the development of Jewish identity in the diaspora?
That's a very meaty one, Joseph. Look, in multiple ways. Firstly, from a cultural perspective, the ability to have a centralized system of cultural exploration is phenomenal, not just for those living inside Israel, but for those living outside. So, you know, without modern Zionism, there arguably wouldn't have been a reinvigoration of modern Hebrew into a conversational language. Modern Hebrew now, after less than 100 years, has spanned you know, the most amazing poems, literary books, music, culture, movies. You guys are watching Founder on Netflix and this show and that show, all in a language that was taken from a biblical text and modified. And I think that even kids now, Jewish children, connecting to cultural elements, Jewish cultural elements, the strength of those Jewish cultural elements come from Israel. I would be very surprised if a kosher deli in New York had better, hummus than a place in Israel, for instance, right? So that Jewish culture has an ability to thrive under its own sovereignty. Writers, artists, and culturally inside Israel, I think the country itself gives a big incentive to that. So from a cultural point of view, I think it's huge. From a religious point of view, if that's your adherence, it's obviously massive as well. The basis for our biblical adherence is to this geographical location where the majority of the stories that occurred in our Bible happened, right? Yeah. So being able to walk the pathway of the patriarchs is an incredible thing. So that connection, I think, will be everlasting. So I think those two religious cultural elements make it very, very critical. Apart from that, our association with half of our people is inside Israel. So demographically, just over 50% of global Jewry lives in this one place. Okay, yep. So if we find ourselves that we have a deep connection with Jewish people here in Australia, it's not out of this world to understand that we have a deep Jewish connection to other Jews around the world, whether that be in London, Boston, New York, Los Angeles, but also in the epicenter of modern Jewish life, which is in Israel.
Yeah, that might lead on well to one of our next questions, which is there not some kind of inherent contradiction within the idea of religious Zionism?
I would unfortunately have to ask you for more comment from the questioner, which you wouldn't be able to ask.
Well, it's just in the sense that, like, would a religious Zionist, or rather members of the religious communities, acknowledge events like Yom Ha'atzmaut, Yom Yerushalayim, things like that?
Look, the simple answer is that they do, right? Yep. So there are segments of the ultra-Orthodox community which you can see on appearance that I am not one of, and I'm very careful to speak about others that I don't know a huge amount of. But when it comes to their definition of Zionism, it does differ. There are some groups inside Judaism that ultimately believe that the creation of the modern state of Israel is an abomination. There are huge segments of the Israeli population, the ultra-Orthodox population inside Israel, that receives the benefit of that sovereign state and votes in that sovereign state and elects ministers in that sovereign state, and essentially is fed by that state. They too believe, or some believe, that the creation and essentially Zionism as it exists now is an abomination because it hasn't been ushered in by the Mashiach. For them, I'm sure, yes, it's a contradiction, but I don't think that that's adopted by the majority of Jews, and certainly not even the majority of religious Jews. The religious Zionist movement is one of the strongest forms of Zionism today, right? The way that they celebrate Zionism may be different from other streams, but that's not to say that it's contradictory, and nor does it actually even give some type of indication as to its relative strength either. Yeah.
We might move on to some questions about the idea of the interaction with different streams of Zionism, as you mentioned, a number of them in your presentation. One question we had was around how does one who doesn't necessarily associate with any one of those streams know or find out about the World Zionist Congress? A lot of people in the community are finding that there isn't much that is being publicized about such an important event that is right around the corner.
Look, it's a good question. We have a media in our community. It's not just the Jewish News; it's others. Every organization has their social media pages, or so those that are actively vying for positions inside that Zionist Congress would be advertising to their list. So if you are attached to one of those organizations or to one of the synagogues that's affiliated with one of the organizations, you'd hear about it. Look, this doesn't happen. This comes around, I think, every 4 or 5 years. And the voting hasn't traditionally been a public thing. I know there's been discussion of it in previous times, but it hasn't been going out into the community to source an actual vote, a physical vote. The proportions have been set by different standards. So it's hard to say. On the one hand, you can say, well, it's up to the individual organizations to promote it to essentially get more votes. So the fact that someone doesn't know about it is a judgment on the organizations that are trying to get votes. On the other hand, I think that the individual themselves that wants or is interested in these things can find out that information if they want. So Plus 61J did an article on it. I know that JY has covered it. The Jewish News covers it. So it's out there, but I think it needs to be a little bit of both. Sometimes it means that the organization's not doing enough to publicize their stuff, but on the other hand, it takes the individual to go looking for it sometimes. Some may say, oh, that's a little bit too much for me, that maxes out my interest, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah. Building on the idea of streams, you mentioned that these streams do have quite a lot of differences, and you also mentioned that these streams are reflected in many ways in, I guess, the Zionist thought and Zionist organizations around the world in the diaspora. I imagine that could cause quite a lot of conflict within the idea of what Jewish nationalism is and how that develops amongst people both inside Israel and outside. Do you see that conflict has the potential to bubble over and actually cause harm to the idea and the movement of Jewish nationalism, or that it's productive and healthy?
Look, I hate these little Jewish jokes that you normally say to non-Jewish groups. Like, if you've got a group of 3 Jews, you have 4 opinions. But realistically, there's a certain accuracy to the adage. And the fact is that we as a people debate things even amongst ourselves, even amongst family. I don't think it's controversial from the outset to have an idea that Jews will have different concepts as to what fits within their ideas of nationalism. I think it's always been there since the first Zionist Congress, and it's obviously there at the current Zionist Congress that will happen later on this year. It forms the basis of some of the ideology of the political parties, and also comes into a lot of discussions that we have here in Australia. I think that the internal discussions are good. Sometimes there's an impression from some streams that other streams are disproportionately stronger. There's many reasons for that, right? I tend to not be one that believes that there's a difficulty in having tough conversations inside the community. I really don't think that there is, and I know that people will feel, no, that's fine, because I'm part of what they would suggest would be the majority held view of Zionism, certainly inside Melbourne, but maybe in the Australian Jewish community, and that others that still consider themselves to be Zionists but don't necessarily have this perception of agreeing with everything that the government does. Yeah. They should feel free to have the conversation. I've never been, I've been an office bearer at the Zionist Federation. I've been to multiple biannual meetings. I've been to, throughout my years with AIJAC, I've had access to the upper echelons of nearly every federal Zionist organization. I've never felt that someone's form of Zionism or stream of Zionism that didn't conform to what would just be the majority held view was somehow not allowed to promote that. And there will be people that will scoff at that. I have no doubt about that. But to me, if my point of view is being forcibly rejected, I think it's incumbent on me to continue to work with inside those established institutions to get a greater voice.
Right.
And that the dialogue can happen. There's another point that I need to stress, right? I work for a public affairs organization, okay? I accept the fact that outside in the big, wide, organized political world, there are very, very strong, well-financed, and very organized factions that don't like Jews. Their dislike of Jews manifests them to not like Israel. And they put a lot of effort into demonizing, into delegitimizing the state. That's the arena that I work in the public arena. My job in that public arena is to do everything that I can to correct that double standard and correct that record, right? Because their attack of Israel is not coming out of some type of pursuit of making Israel a better place for Jewish people. It's for ultimately our destruction. So if publicly I or others inside the organized Jewish community publicly relate or project what can be argued as unconditional support of that current government or their current or the actions or the majority of their actions, even though AIJAC publicly disagrees with some things that the Israeli government does from time to time as well. We're not beholden to them, but within that political arena, that unconditional support has its place because it needs to balance out the very well organized and very well drilled anti-Israel elements inside our society, not just inside our cultural society, but in our political society as well. And that also doesn't mean that I can't have a discussion with anyone inside the Jewish community about their forms of Zionism. It also doesn't mean that I should be pigeonholed for other Jews to have to come to a conclusion as to what my form of Zionism is. Even in my public statements, even in the abundant presentations that I give, ultimately my views are my views, and I only share my views if I'm asked. So I get pigeonholed in a certain stream of Zionism when I don't get asked as to what I actually feel or what stream I identify. That identifier is placed on me by others. So my point is that realistically, the dialogue's open. So those that feel from a different stream should feel free to have that discussion and dialogue.
It actually does well to move into our next question, which you kind of have answered in that discussion there. But I know that for a lot of inside and outside the Jewish and the Zionist community, to identify with Zionism and to identify with Jewish nationalism is to essentially support, the idea of, the common misconceptions like an apartheid state or things like the idea of settlements, things that you don't necessarily have to support, but can also identify as a Zionist. So maybe, do you want to maybe discuss the idea of, and you kind of have in your discussion, but how broad the term and the identity of Zionism actually is?
So look, it depends on the era that you're talking about. So pre-state era, the word nationalism actually meant something different to what it does now. So nationalism generally has a negative connotation to it, some type of nationalist purity or superiority over another, that one's pursuit of nationalism needs to be at the expense of another. I don't buy into that. All right, to be honest with you, my form of strident Jewish, my narrative of Jewish Zionism or Jewish nationalism does not preclude the establishment of a continuous and strong Palestinian state, even with East Jerusalem or elements of East Jerusalem as its capital. So I think it's a little bit simplistic to suggest that one necessarily being a Jewish nationalist means that I'm in somehow anti-Palestinian self-determination. I'm not. Right, and again, all you would have to do is ask that question, and you'd be able to get a nuanced answer as to how the two can operate at the same time. So you should be careful not to just attach negative connotations to a word just due to the current context that it's perceived in today, as opposed to what it was in the 40s or the 30s, or even in the late 19th century. Right? The pursuit of nationalism wasn't a bad thing. The pursuit of nationalism doesn't necessarily have to be at the expense of another. In actual fact, the organized Zionists wing would show you that it was never at the expense. They accepted agreements from the start of the partition, through negotiations and agreements with Faisal and with Weizmann, from the Peel Partition Plan in 1937 to the UN Partition Plan in 1947. These were all nationalist movements that were willing to accept the partition, to accept their nationalism, not at the expense of the other, but alongside the other.
Yeah.
That still exists in my form of Jewish nationalism today. And so they're not incompatible. So those that feel as though that they, when it comes to nationalism, it needs to manifest in some type of Jewish superiority over the other, whether or not that's the Arab inhabitants and citizens of Israel or the Palestinians living in the territories. I don't buy into that.
Yep. So moving on to maybe our final question. Something that you did mention.
We go all night, Joey. If you've got more questions, I'm here.
Something that you did mention in your presentation is in the development of the state of Israel, anti-Semitism obviously had a massive part to play in the motivations for why a state needed to exist. And I know for a lot of people inside and outside the community, the view on the role that anti-Semitism plays currently is quite different. And for some, you can obviously see that it's a prominent problem, but for a lot of people, it may not necessarily be as large or as great a problem as maybe it once was. And for a lot of people, that then defines the way they see Israeli Jewish nationalism, the need for a state of Israel, things like that. What do you think about that?
Oh, look, I think that we could try and make it a difficult answer, but I think the answer is quite simple. Look, again, I think a recent survey was done by Andrew Marcus into the feelings on Israel and anti-Semitism of a select group of young Jews that came out recently, as early as today. And the perception was that anti-Semitism is considered by a lot to still be a real issue. So even if it is or it isn't, right, let's just take the fact that you can have your own personal opinion as to whether or not anti-Semitism for you as an individual is a big deal. Like, I'll give you an example. If you're a Jewish university student, your exposure to anti-Semitism on one campus is going to be completely different to the other. So I think the individual is informed by their own experience. But when it comes to how quickly things can change, you only need to look at the example in the UK with the rise of Corbyn and Corbynism, right? So you had this guy that comes out of nowhere, right? And now he was a known personality, but he was always a fringe politician inside the Labour Party, rises to the ranks of the head of the Labour Party and goes to elections, right? Where we all were not, comforted by the fact that the Conservatives had better polling than what he did. We were genuinely fearful that England was going to have an anti-Semite as a prime minister. Right, so anti-Semitism in the UK, especially with my age group, like, I actually know people that obtained Israeli citizenship and had bags packed and things set up ready to get out of England. Families that had been there for 15, 16, 17 generations that were ready to leave England because of one bloke, yep. Right? So things can change really quickly. And I really, look, and I probably shouldn't do this, but my brother and I have divergent views on Jewish nationalism, Zionism, and a lot of other different things. And I'm not saying this in a bad way. We got a good relationship, but we differ on this. And it became clear to me that the main difference is that we don't quite understand what I perceived and believed that he didn't quite understand, how quickly things can change for us and how many people out there just don't like us. So from both sides of the spectrum, of the organized political spectrum, both the left and the right, there's a huge amount of organized distaste and dislike for Jewish people. And even in a society like Australia, which is one of the safest places, if not the safest place outside of Israel for Jewish people. And it's fantastic that it continues to be, one of the most special places where we can feel free to be whatever type of Jew we want to be. It can change very, very quickly. So those that may be comforted by the fact that anti-Semitism is not what it was before, I don't think they should be under any type of misconception as to how things can change and how things can change in places that they don't expect it to. And England is the best contemporary example of that. People were scared. People were legitimately frightened at what Corbyn and his allies and his friends were doing and what they could have done. That was a legitimate fear, and that happened out of nowhere. Okay.
Yeah. Awesome. So I think we're gonna cut it there because we have just tipped over the hour mark. So I just want to thank everybody that joined us tonight for our second Talking About Israel session, and obviously a massive thank you to Joel Burnie for taking the time to share some of his very insightful knowledge with us. And as always, a massive thank you to the continued support of our generous sponsors. This was only number 2 of 5 of Talking About Israel. We do have more sessions that will be coming up every Tuesday for the next 3 weeks. Next week, we're actually going to look at narratives of Palestinian nationalism, and that'll be facilitated by Dr. Ben Gurion, who's currently Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia. So stay tuned for more information about next week's session. And once again, thank you to everybody that came tonight. Thank you to Joel, and looking forward to seeing everyone next week.